Today we go into Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, which is the extension of the accounts that began in the book of Ezra. As you remember, the first wave of refugees, exiles who came back from Babylon to Jerusalem came under the leadership of Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel. And they began by the building of the great altar, then all of the excitement with the rebuilding of the second temple. The second wave actually came with Ezra, and Ezra began a series of reforms, reading the Torah. There was a deep moral response to Ezra's preaching, particularly with respect to the mixed marriages of Israelites and pagans. And now we come to Nehemiah. And the book of Nehemiah really carries this same story right on into the next number of years in the post-exilic community. The renewal that was begun by Ezra is going to be carried on and aided by the coming of Nehemiah. And all during this time, though the neighboring peoples that had surrounded the Jews that came back to Jerusalem had been compelled to allow the temple reconstruction, of course they didn't want the temple to be reconstructed and they did their best to hinder it and to stop it. But even though they had been compelled to allow it, because Ezra actually came with authorization from the empire, they continued to harass the Jews, they continued to intimidate them, do their best to discourage the work. And about the time that Ezra arrived, the Jews had begun to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. You find this in Ezra chapter 4 and verse 12. This is the section in the book of Ezra where I said there was this parenthesis in chapter 4 between the beginning of chapter 4 and the end of chapter 4. And in that parenthesis, in which it describes various attempts to discourage the Jews had begun to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. A letter of protest had been sent to Artaxerxes from the locals surrounding Jerusalem. And due to that, all work on the walls was forced to stop. And you find that again in Ezra chapter 4. So it's during this time that Hanani, a Jew who is almost certainly thought to be Nehemiah's brother. He is called the brother, and we're assuming it's the brother of Nehemiah. He has traveled all the way from Jerusalem back to the heartland of Persia to report to Nehemiah what was happening in Jerusalem. He told him that the walls were broken down and that the gates had been burned with fire. Now, at first glance, you might suppose that the gates being burned and the walls being knocked down, that this goes back all the way to the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. But perhaps this description in the first part of Nehemiah refers not merely to what the Babylonians had done back in 586 BC, but what local officials had done in their zeal to enforce the stop order of Artaxerxes. They also may have broken down wall sections and burned the gates with fire. In any case, this report came to Nehemiah about 445 BC, which was in the 20th regnal year of Artaxerxes, according to the first verse of Nehemiah chapter 2. Now, going back to the structure of Ezra chapter 4, you may remember that this chapter is a difficult chapter in that it is not chronological. There's this big parenthesis in the middle between verse 6 and verse 23. And it is in this big parenthesis that you have the description of this stop order from Artaxerxes I. The stop order does not happen with any relevance to the rebuilding of the temple, but it certainly affected the issue of the security of Jerusalem in the time of Nehemiah. So this stop order has come from Artaxerxes all the way from the heartland of Persia, and the Jews have had to stop. The locals have taken it upon themselves to enforce this order. And so now the Jews, while they have the temple rebuilt, they still live in a city that has a lot of broken sections of walls. The gates are burned, and so it is not very secure. At this point, it will probably be a good idea to review the Jews and the rulers of the Persian Empire. And what I've done here is I've listed all of the rulers of Persia from Cyrus, who is the ruler who allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, all the way down to the reign of Darius III, which is the last Persian ruler before the invasion of Alexander the Great. So the decree to return comes in the reign of Cyrus. This is in 539 BC. Then, of course, you remember that they started work by laying the stones of the great altar and laying the foundation of the first temple. And even though the altar was reconstructed and the temple begun, they had to stop work in 536. And then for 16 years, there is this hiatus when there is no work done on the temple. Finally, in 520, particularly because of the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah, the Jews are able to once again sort of get themselves together, Zerubbabel and Joshua leading them, and they begin to renew the work on the temple so that it is finally completed in 516 BC. Then it's going to be quite a bit of time later, another half a century before Ezra is going to come, which is near the end of the book of Ezra. And so we saw that in our last book. He comes during the reign of Artaxerxes I. And then a few years after that, we have then this third wave that comes, which is the return of Nehemiah. And so that's where we are in the chronology of rulers in the ancient Persian world. Now, back to Nehemiah as a person. Nehemiah, when he hears this news from Hanani, his brother, he's very upset by this. The fact that Jerusalem is unprotected, the fact that there is a lot of harassment from locals toward the work. And so with a prayer of confession and asking for God's help, he determined that he should do something about it. But what should he do? How could he do something? He is in Persia, and actually he is in the service of the Emperor Artaxerxes himself. His occupation was that of a trusted officer of high rank. He was called the cupbearer to Artaxerxes. Now, for modern people, I would suppose that the idea of a cupbearer doesn't sound too significant. But in the ancient world, emperors were always in danger of assassination. Physical assassination could be protected against by an imperial guard, and in fact, the Persians had an imperial guard that surrounded the emperor. So trying to break in to assassinate the emperor by force was very well protected against. But the one thing that was always a danger that could be done surreptitiously was to poison the emperor. And so often this was done by somehow altering his food or altering his drink. And so the person who was the cupbearer to the emperor was a very important person, that he was absolutely trusted by the emperor. I mean, this is the one man, if you were going to poison the emperor, this is the one man you wanted to get to if you were going to try to do this. And so Nehemiah, serving as the cupbearer to Artaxerxes, was in a highly, highly trusted position. His duties would have consisted of tasting and serving wine to the king. Of course, it sounds almost humorous, but if the cupbearer dies, of course, Artaxerxes is not going to drink any of this stuff. Or if the cupbearer gets sick because of the food, then Artaxerxes won't eat any of it. So his duties, therefore, are to taste food, to taste wine, due to the possibility of plots against the king's life, especially by poison. So Nehemiah is in this trusted position, but he doesn't know exactly how to broach the subject to Artaxerxes. But 4 months later, he finally has an opportunity to express his concerns. Artaxerxes apparently notices that Nehemiah is downcast, and he asks him about it, and out of this circumstance, then Nehemiah is able to tell his story. Incidentally, here are a couple of silver and gold Persian rhytons. A rhyton is a special drinking vessel that was popular in the royal sections of Persia. These are from the 4th and the 5th century BC, and they illustrate, at least to some degree, the luxury of ancient Persia and the excellence in metalsmithing. The rhyton on the left is made out of silver, and you can find this one displayed in the British Museum in London, England. And the one on the right is from the Tehran National Museum in the Middle East, and it is in gold. But as you can see, these are quite elaborate drinking cups, the sort that Nehemiah would have served to his emperor. Now, the Persian Empire had a number of quite important cities, but probably the two most important were Persepolis and Susa. These two cities were administrative centers for the Persian Empire, and Darius and Xerxes and now Artaxerxes all have worked to erect their state buildings in these cities, and they've been working on these cities for over a half a century by the time we get to the lifetime of Nehemiah. Nehemiah then is found in Susa, where he first heard this report about Jerusalem's sad condition from his brother Hanani. This is a picture of Persepolis from the air, and as you can see, it's quite an extensive excavated site. Archaeologists have been working on this for some time. You can see from the air some of the standing pillars in the Hall of Columns. There's a variety of state buildings that are in this picture. And then in the next one, you can see the Gate of All Nations, which is at Persepolis. It shows the composite creatures at the gate, the guardian creatures, which are forms of cherubim. They are composite creatures with the body of a bull, the wings of an eagle, the face of a human. And these were typically at the entries to the palaces. Then there are some foundation works here you can see that were constructed by Darius I. These are fairly early parts of the construction of Persepolis. Then there's another picture that shows the King's Hall in Susa, which was completed by Artaxerxes. This would be, of course, Nehemiah's Artaxerxes. In this particular picture, you can see another one of the composite creatures which are so central to the iconography of the ancient world. In this one, you can see a creature that has quite a number of animal parts. The two hind legs are the claws of an eagle. The two front legs are the paws of a lion. Then it has eagle's wings. Then a body which is a little less easy to identify, perhaps the body of a lion, perhaps the body of a bull. And then a face with two ram's horns. And it may recall for you that in the book of Daniel, there is a vision in which Daniel sees a ram with two horns that represents Persia. So this is kind of the iconography of the Persian Empire where Daniel was. Here's another detail from Susa. This is currently displayed in the Louvre at Paris. This is a lancer detail from the palace of Darius I in Susa. And there's a good number of Persian artifacts in the Louvre in Paris. So should you ever have the chance to go to Paris and go to the Louvre, in addition to seeing more famous things like perhaps the Mona Lisa, you might want to go to the Near Eastern section and see some of the things from the period of Nehemiah. This depiction is a satrap, the provincial official that receives a visitor. This is in the British Museum in London. And the term satrap, which is used in the Bible, particularly in the book of Esther, is one of these officials that are described here. Here is actually a depiction of Artaxerxes I. This is the Artaxerxes of Nehemiah, and he is receiving courtiers and a religious official, and this is from the Hall of 100 Columns in Persepolis. As we noticed in one of the previous bas-reliefs of Persian emperors, this one has been defaced, and so the faces of the emperor and the faces of some of the courtiers have been smashed off. Presumably these were done later by probably the Greeks when they invaded Persia and took over Persian lands. These are the tombs of Darius II, Artaxerxes I, and Darius the Great. So you can see they're carved out of the bedrock in this very steep cliff, quite elaborate tombs. And this is a close-up of the tomb of Artaxerxes I, the Artaxerxes that we read about in the book of Nehemiah. It's about 3 miles more or less north of Persepolis, and again carved into the bedrock of this very steep cliff. So now, Nehemiah is going to gain permission to go to Jerusalem and to assist in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Normally, people who were in service to the emperor usually shielded their feelings. It's not a good idea to be in service to the emperor and have a sort of a grumpy countenance or a downcast face. But in this case, Nehemiah is so disturbed by the situation of his home city in Jerusalem that he apparently is unable to restrain his deep feelings. And Artaxerxes asked him about this. And out of this, Nehemiah was courageous enough to request that something be done about the stop order that stopped the reconstruction of the walls of Jerusalem. In fact, Nehemiah will offer to oversee the project himself if the emperor would allow him to go And of course, as I mentioned, Nehemiah is very much a trusted person to Artaxerxes. And so if Artaxerxes would allow Nehemiah to go, he would go to Jerusalem and he would actually oversee the rebuilding of the walls himself to make sure that this was done properly and that there was no suspicion attached to it. So Artaxerxes' trust in Nehemiah is very evident in that he agrees, I will reverse this stop order. And so he issues official documents authorizing Nehemiah to return to Jerusalem. Not only to return, but he gives him a detachment of the army, and he gives them instructions and permission to cut timber for gate construction. Now, walls, of course, are built out of cut stone or laid stone, or in some cases field stone if they can be fit together. But gates generally have to be made out of wood, because gates have to open and close, so they can't withstand the kind of weight that would be necessary if you tried to build a gate out of stone. So cutting timber for gate construction is really quite important. Well, Nehemiah, of course, is going to do this. He's going to go to Jerusalem with a detachment of Persian cavalry, armed with these letters of authorization from Artaxerxes I. And I'm sure that when he appears in the Trans-Euphrates region of Persia, the officials there are not very happy. All along, they've been trying to discourage the rebuilding of the temple. They've been trying to discourage the work of the Jews in resituating themselves. They were the ones, of course, who were instrumental in getting the stop order in the first place. Now Nehemiah is back, not only with authorization to renew the building of the walls, he also has a detachment of the army with him, which gives him military force. And so, not surprisingly, the Trans-Euphrates officials are pretty upset with the arrival of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah needs to decide exactly what needs to be done. So he is going to inspect the walls, but in this particular case, he is going to do this at night from the back of a horse. Interestingly enough, just in the broader sense of the word, the use of horses in the Persian Empire for cavalry is more or less a new development in military strategy in the ancient world. Prior to the time of the Persians, horses were primarily used for chariotry. They were military creatures, but they were used to pull chariotry. But the Persians began using horses and horsemen as cavalry. And so Nehemiah has come to Jerusalem with a detachment of Persian cavalry. He, of course, has a horse himself. And now he begins going around the wall sections of the ancient city of David, looking at the various points where the wall is broken down from horseback. As he moves his way around the walls, he finally comes to a place where his horse is unable to even negotiate the terrain because it's so steep, and the broken rock that has been crashed down from the walls, the passages are so narrow. So Nehemiah has to actually get off his horse and work his way through this debris by foot as he negotiates what actually needs to be done. In this particular drawing, you'll see this map, which is by an Israeli archaeologist, Aharoni. You're going to see that at the bottom of the map, there is a dotted line that moves from the Valley Gate, working southward in a counterclockwise fashion, and then comes up on the eastern side of the ancient Hill of Ophel, which is the city of David. And you'll see a label there, a couple of labels there, that mentions this is Nehemiah's night walk and where he continues to walk by foot. So these are in the ancient area of what is called the city of David, the ancient part of the city of Jerusalem that originally David had conquered all the way back around 1000 BC in the time of the Jebusites. So Nehemiah reconnoiters the wall, he inspects it, he decides where it needs attention, and he's going to report back. Now in this next slide, you will see an aerial photograph of the city of David. And if the conjectures by Aharoni and Avioni, which are two Israeli archaeologists, if those are correct, and probably most scholars think they are correct, then some of Nehemiah's locations can be approximated that are mentioned actually in the book of Nehemiah. For one thing, Nehemiah mentions starting near the Valley Gate. And the assumption is that this is probably the gate that is at the top of the Tyropian Valley, which is the valley to the western side of the Hill of Ophel. Then, all the way down at the bottom, there is what is called the Dung Gate. This one is more readily identifiable because it was called the Dung Gate in a number of contexts in the Old Testament. This is sort of the area of Jerusalem where people threw their garbage. Then there is what is called the Fountain Gate. This one we're a little less certain about. We're not sure what the fountain is. And then there is one that is called the King's Pool. Well, that name is again a little puzzling. If that is the Pool of Siloam, then it is where this red arrow points. If it's not the Pool of Siloam, then we're not quite sure where the King's Pool is. But at least these are some of the possible areas that Nehemiah reconnoitered when he is looking at the wall sections that have been broken down. Then finally, he mentions the valley at the end, which is probably the Kidron Valley, the valley on the east side of the hill of Ophel. Here's a small artifact that is of interest. This one also appears in the British Museum in London. It is a rare depiction of a Persian on horseback, from about the time of Nehemiah, about the 5th century BC. And it's a reminder of the extensive use of horses by the Persians. And of course, the fact that Nehemiah travels with the cavalry to Jerusalem and inspects the walls from horseback, at least as much as he could. So this gives you at least a visual of a little bit what a Persian horseman looks like, and the Persian headdress and the tackle for the horse himself. After inspecting the walls, Nehemiah confronts the community of Jews in Jerusalem. He has taken his tour by horse, he has looked at the walls, he has trudged around the east side on foot. Now he talks to the officials about the problems that he found and challenges them. We need to begin to reconstruct these city walls. And of course, he has authorization to do exactly that from Artaxerxes. He explains to them the authorization that he has, and I would suppose showed to them the actual letters of authorization that Artaxerxes had given him. And so rebuilding the walls, of course, is going to immediately receive kickbacks from the Trans-Euphrates officials who are not happy about this. So the Trans-Euphrates officials, both to the north, the east, and the south, immediately begin to oppose this. And Jerusalem is clearly surrounded by hostile parties. We actually have a little inscription that links one of these officials, the one by the name of Sanballat, with the construction of the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. And Sanballat is apparently the Trans-Euphrates Persian governor of the area called Samaria. The two others that are particularly important are Tobiah the Ammonite. He would be the Trans-Euphrates Persian governor of Ammon in the Transjordan. And then there is Geshem, who is the Arab, who is the Trans-Euphrates Persian governor of northern Arabia. We actually have Geshem's name in a couple of other ancient inscriptions, one on a silver vessel, as it mentions here, and the other in an ancient king list. But these three, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, these are the three who lead the opposition to Nehemiah and to the Jews who are trying to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. But in spite of all of the opposition against them, the reconstruction of the walls begins. It's narrated in the book of Nehemiah in a counterclockwise circuit, so various Jewish families signing on to complete certain sections of the walls. Now, it's probably important to realize that when we talk about the walls being broken down in Jerusalem, we are not necessarily saying the walls were entirely removed. There were probably substantial sections of wall that were still standing, but there would be big gaps in these walls where breaches had been made and where pieces of the walls had been broken out. So these are the parts that they're going to be working on. They're going to try to close these gaps to make the walls secure. And of course, they will eventually have to create gates for the various entrances and exits to the city. Gates control the traffic in and out of fortified cities, and usually they're flanked by towers, which are manned with defenders, usually archers or sometimes people throwing stones down if there were enemies trying to breach the gates. And so the towers are quite important also in times of war. Well, the Trans-Euphrates officials could hardly oppose Nehemiah with force. They couldn't just come in and tell him to stop because, after all, he had authorization from the emperor and he was backed by a detachment of the army. So Nehemiah is in a pretty good situation right here, but they did set about to try to discourage the construction. And so they did it sort of surreptitiously, by ridicule, by intimidation, by doing their best to discourage the work. Here is an archaeological picture of excavations that very well may be one of the gate towers at Jerusalem that Nehemiah built. If you look at the photograph on the right, the lower right, you will see archaeologist Eli Shukran. He's kind of leaning back against the length of the wall there. This was taken in 1999 along the slope of the city of David. Possibly part of the tower. Then if you look at the sketch in the upper left, this is an archaeologist's reconstruction of that tower by drawing. And you'll notice that some of it has, near the base of the one tower, has kind of red ink in the drawing. This is the part that actually is discovered by the archaeologists today. The rest of the drawing is simply a reconstruction of what the tower probably looked like, based upon other archaeological knowledge. We also see in this wall section of Jerusalem what is called the straight joint. This is a wall section about 100 feet or so north of the southern end of the wall of Jerusalem. And the thing I want you to notice is how that in this straight joint there are two kinds of masonry courses. To the left, there is masonry that we can almost certainly say was from the time of Herod the Great, almost in the time of Jesus. This type of masonry, which has a particular style of boss and edging on the quarried stones, was very peculiar to the time of Herod. But if you look to the right side of that straight joint, you'll see a very different type of masonry. And this type of masonry might even go back to the time of Nehemiah. At least that was the opinion of Kathleen Kenyon of the British Museum, that the stone courses to the right of the straight joint might actually go to the time of Nehemiah. Well, we don't know that for sure. That is somewhat debatable, and archaeologists still fuss about that sort of thing, but at least it gives you a feel for the kinds of things that were happening in the walls of Jerusalem in the time of Nehemiah. And finally, there is this one section here that this is discovered quite recently, just within the last few years, a 30-meter section of wall that is almost certainly going back to the time of Nehemiah. This is discovered by Dr. Eilat Mazar, who is currently excavating in the city of David and the area of Jerusalem along the southern part. And so this wall is very probably one that was built by Nehemiah in 445 BC.